So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off at this point so we can focus on the slides here. And so first we're going to start with a little bit about Creole. We are a 100% Oracle service provider. We've gone through over 100 successful implementations. I personally am on our cloud team where we're implementing Oracle ERP Cloud for many of our clients. We also have many cloud application specializations in our team, as well as 2 Oracle ACE experts. And for a little bit about myself, I'm a technical associate with Creole. I started in June of 2018, so I'm coming up on 3 years with Creole this summer. And I started with them straight out of college after I graduated from UNC Wilmington, where I majored in information systems and finance. I am also an Oracle certified specialist. I have the certification in application integration, which is the certification that focuses on Oracle integration cloud primarily. I also am a certified associate in project management, which I got during my initial year at Creole, where I started as a project administrator. And then I switched over to the technical track, where I've been working with tools such as SQL Developer, BIP reports, Apex, OIC, Visual Builder, and doing many data imports into various modules in ERP Cloud. So for this session, I'd like to focus primarily on a business scenario example of how we can apply these PaaS tools. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the basics of what the tools are and how to use them in general, and how to actually create various components and things like that. There are plenty of easily accessible resources online for that kind of thing. Today, I'd like to focus more so on this specific example and the configurations and components that are required to complete this solution. And I found while I was building this solution for one of our previous clients, some of this stuff is not well documented yet, so I'd like to share that today. So to start out with this example, we'll go through the BIP report, which is the first step in the data flow essentially, and then the second step is the OIC integration to call that report. And then I'll share the Visual Builder form that's going to be built. And then finally, another OIC integration, which will be used to update a DFF in ERP to close out the loop on the data flow for this solution. So to cover the business scenario example, this is what we'll be considering today. So in this case, the requirement is that the client wants a custom form, which will be in Visual Builder, so that their accounts payable manager can review and approve all of their AP invoices before they're paid. So the solution for this is to display all the AP invoice and related supplier data from the ERP instance in the Visual Builder form. And then the user can go in and approve or reject each invoice on the distribution level and then save it. And saving that will update what is the status DFF in an ERP. So this is a DFF that's configured just to hold the approval and rejection status for each distribution. So first step in the process is to create the BIP report in OTBI. So this is the query that I'm using for this example. The reason why the BIP report is so useful in this case is because it allows us to select the very specific fields we want without anything extra, and we can pick data from across a couple different modules as well. So in this case, I'm primarily selecting AP invoice data but there's also a field in there that's from the suppliers module as well. So all of the fields selected here are listed to the right, just for ease of reading this. And then the other thing to notice here that's important is the attribute that I mentioned for the DFF that will hold the approved or rejected status. This will be in attribute 14 on the distribution. So we want to select only the distributions where this status is currently null, meaning it has not been approved or rejected yet. So all we do for the data model is take that query I just showed and create a data model with just one data set, which is G1, and there aren't any parameters or anything. This is a fairly straightforward data model just to export this set of data that we need for the Visual Builder form. And then from there, we have to create the report so that we can actually run the report and get the data out of cloud. So this report, again, is very simple. It's just a plain XML output. And it's very important that we select XML here, because when we run this report using SOAP web service, it's looking for an XML output. Okay, so that's it for the BIP report. That piece is fairly straightforward, but can be customized based on which exact fields you want to select from ERP. So the next step is to create an OIC integration to call that report, run it, and get the output of the report. So starting out, if you've worked with OIC at all before, you always have to create connections first. So the first connection we're going to create is just a generic REST trigger. This will just be used to kick off all of our integrations. The second connection is the SOAP report service, which is what we're going to use to actually run the BIP report. So in this one, we're configuring a SOAP connection, and we wanted to find the WSDL URL. So this URL is just the base URL from your Cloud ERP instance, and I've blocked out the piece that's specific to the instance I was working in. But yes, essentially just the base URL you're working with. And then the remainder of that URL is the piece of the web service that actually defines that we're running the external report service. And then finally, for this connection, you need to configure authentication so that this can actually access the report within ERP. So I just used basic authentication and entered the credentials that are set up in the ERP instance. And then the final connection for this integration is a REST connection, which will connect to the Visual Builder application that we're working in. So I called the Visual Builder app just sample app, and the connection URL down at the bottom here can be found from the business object endpoints that are created in the Visual Builder application. So there's a little bit of back and forth here. In order to do one piece of this process, you have to create another piece. So in this case, the Visual Builder application and one business object has to be created so that you can get this URL. But for the sake of just following the overall process flow, at this point, we're focusing on this OIC integration. But essentially, once you've built your Visual Builder app and one business object, you would open that up and go to endpoints and resource APIs. And then this is where you'll find the URL that you need to set up the OIC connection. And it's important to notice here that we only want to use the URL through the word data. And that's because when we actually call this connection from the OIC integration, that's where we'll define which specific business object we want to connect to. and that's where we'll enter the remainder of the URL there for the invoice approval business object. Okay, so that's it for the connections we need at this point. And this is an overview of the whole integration that we'll be going through. And it's just split a little bit to make it fit better on the slide here. So starting at the top left and then continuing over to the right there. So initially we'll use our REST trigger connection to kick off the integration. And then we'll connect to ERP, run the BIP report, write the response from that SOAP web service to a file, then read the file, and then we'll loop through every record in the SOAP response, which is just the data that came from the BIP report, and we'll insert it into the invoice approval business object in the Visual Builder application. So going into a little more detail on how some of these components are configured. Again, I'm going to focus just on the more key points of these configurations. So in a lot of cases, I'll skip the basic info tab and anything that we're not actually working with just for this solution. So for the REST trigger, we want to set up the resource URI, and this is something that you can define to whatever you'd like. So I called this run report, and then I select a put action for this trigger. And the put actions are useful for the triggers because it lets you decide whether or not you want this integration to be asynchronous or synchronous. Asynchronous means that there's no response returned at the end, and synchronous means that there is a response returned at the end. So for this one specifically, we don't need any response. So you'll notice down at the bottom, the option to configure the endpoint to receive the response is unchecked. And then we don't have any parameters or request payload in this example either. So that's it for the REST trigger. The next component, again, if you've worked with OIC at all before, you'll know that whenever you create a component that requires a mapping, you have to configure the component itself first, and then the mapping component will be automatically created above it, and then you go back and configure the mapping. So that's why we're skipping the mapping for now, and we'll go back to it in a couple minutes. So to configure the SOAP connection, this is the connection we created to run the report. So the WSDL that we entered into the connection defines a lot of the details we need. So all we have to do here is select the operation. So we just want to run the BIP report, and then all the other fields here will be auto-populated. And that is all we need to do to configure that connection there. And then we'll go back to the mapping, and this is where we'll actually define which report we want it to run. So that's what the mapping canvas looks like. We're not actually going to be dragging anything from sources to target. In this case, we'll be defining all of our target nodes based on just text values. So there are 3 different target nodes we need to define. The first one is an attribute format. This is just going to be XML, again, because we set the output of the file to XML for the BIP report. And then the second one is the report absolute path, which is just the path including the file extension, which is always .xdo for BIP reports. And this is how we tell the SOAP connection what report we actually want it to look for and run. And then you'll also notice here, I didn't include the share folders in the beginning of the file path. This is just assumed here, so it's not required to actually include that in the file path. And then finally, we'll set the size of data chunk download to -1. Okay, and then the next component we want to configure is a stage file component where we'll write the response of the web service. So the reason why we need to do this is because the response of that SOAP web service is in base64 format. So we need to write it, which essentially kind of decodes it, and then we'll read it, and then we can actually use that data from there. So we'll create a stage file component and select the write file operation. And then we can define a file name and output directory. You can set these to whatever you want at this point. This just creates a space for the file to be saved in the ICS file directory. And then next step on this is to define the XML schema XSD document. So we want to select that in the schema options list, and then we will upload a file. So you have to have a separate file saved off to upload here. I called mine opaque schema.xsd, and then within the file, which I'll show you the contents of in a second, there's a schema element, which is called opaque element, which is what will be selected right here in the configuration. So this is the contents of this file. So this can be exactly the same for all of the times that you need to write a file from a BIP response from this web service that we're using. The most important thing to note here, though, is that the element name, which I just mentioned, is opaque element, and then the type is base64 binary. So you want to make sure you include that so that when you're writing the file, it knows that it's taking base64 from the web service response. So after configuring the stage file to write the response, we want to map to that. So the mapping for this is pretty straightforward. All we want to do is drill down into the run report service response, which is the SOAP web service that was called, and drill down into that until you find report bytes. And the report bytes is what holds all of the data from the output of the report. And then we'll just click and drag that over to the opaque element that we just configured in the write SOAP response stage file component. So after that, we want to read the file that we just created so that we can access that data. And the read file does not have a mapping component that goes along with it. This is another stage file action, and we just select that the file operation is to read the entire file. Like I said, there's no mapping for this one. All we need to do is specify which file we want to read. So in this case, I prefer to actually pick up the write file name and directory source rather than trying to retype or copy and paste this in here. And that way you just know for sure that you're picking up the correct file. So to do that, you just click the pencil edit icon to the right of the file name and directory fields, and it'll open up the editor. And I called my write operation write SOAP response. So I just drill down into that through the ICS file into the properties, and that's where you'll find the file name and directory. Okay, and then from there, similarly to the write operation, we want to use an XML schema XSD document, and we'll upload a separate file. In this case, though, the schema element is going to be called data.ds. And this file is a little bit more involved. There's a bit more content, but it has to be specific to the output of the BIP report that you've run. So the way that I usually create this file is I open up the BIP report in the analytics catalog, and I export the data. And then that'll download an XML sample file. And then from there, I usually just open up a online tool that will convert an XML sample file into XSD. That's what I found is the simplest way to just get that file started and get the majority of what you need in it. So this is an example of the tool that I generally use. I just upload my XML sample and hit generate XSD, and it will allow me to download another file with the XSD schema, which looks like this. So there's a couple important things to note here. The first one is the element name of data DS, which I just mentioned, that needs to be included in the OIC component configuration. The other couple things that'll be useful to know for later on is that the element name is G1, and then the max occurs and min occurs, we need to make sure those are included because that's what defines the G1 element as a repeating element. And that's really important since generally when you run a BIP report, you have more than one record in the response. So this is a repeating element, one for each record that we're going to loop through later on. And then the last section here just lists all of the data fields and their types. And it's important to note here as well that in the XML sample that you use to generate this file, this will only pick up anything that there was actually sample data for. So if for some reason there isn't any sample data for a specific field, it won't come up here automatically when you generate the file. And this happens fairly often, especially for things like description fields that might not be on every record. But at this point, you can just add in whatever fields may have been missed in your sample. Okay, so that's the read file option. So next, we're going to loop through all of the data from the BIP report that we just read. So we'll configure a for each loop. And this is pretty straightforward. This is the only page in the configuration for this. You can name it whatever you like. And then, like I mentioned, the repeating element is called G1. So you can just click and drag that over from the source list. And then the current element name, you can name this whatever you like. That's descriptive enough that when you are trying to use these records later on, you know to work within the loop of the data rather than from the read SOAP response section, since the file or the data structure will look the same. So I just called mine current record. So within this loop, this is where we're going to actually insert that data from the BIP report into the VBCS business object. So this is where we'll use the REST connection that was configured previously to connect to the sample application in Visual Builder. And to configure this, this is where we define the remainder of that URI, which specifies which business object we want to work with. So that's why I've inserted invoice approval BO there, because that's the business object that I want to insert the data into. And then the action for this one is post, which is just a insert. And then since we are inserting data, we need to configure a request payload for this endpoint. So to configure the requests, this one's pretty simple for a post operation. I usually just use the JSON sample and the inline option to set this up. So when you open up the inline sample JSON for a post action, it's just a list of all the fields in the business object and a sample of what the data for each field will look like. So that's it for configuring the REST connection. Then we'll go back to the mapping for this. And in this case, every field is mapping from our current record, which is the current record being looped through at the time. And like I mentioned, the structure is the same as the business or the BIP report output here. with all the same fields. And on the right here is the business object that was just set up in the connection to the sample application. And so the way I have this set up, the business object pretty much mimics the BIP output. So all of these fields are just mapped left to right with nearly the same names: invoice ID to invoice ID, distribution description to distribution description, etc. So that is all for the mapping of that piece. And then that's the end of this integration. So now we have the data we want to work with. So now we can get into the Visual Builder form. So similarly to an integration, you need to set up the connections first. So in this case, the only connections we really need is to the integrations that are relevant to this app in OIC. So I like to set up one server that connects to the OIC instance, and then multiple endpoints to connect to each integration that I want to actually call from this application. So the server URL is populated through the word REST, and then the remainder of that URL is found in the individual endpoints that will specify which integration you want to call, and then the endpoint of the REST trigger. So in this case, we're going to end up with two integrations that we're going to be calling from this application. The first one is the Run BIP report integration that we just went through, and the second one is to update the distribution DFF on the distribution in the ERP application, and we'll go into more detail on that integration a little bit later. So the way that you can find the URL for that service connection is to go to an active integration in OIC, click Run, and it'll pop up this menu with the metadata URL. So when you click on that URL, it'll open another tab in your web browser with the endpoint description and the endpoint URL. And the endpoint URL is what we use to set up that server and endpoint for this integration. So within this Visual Builder application, I've only got two business objects for this example. The first one is the invoice approval BO. And like I mentioned previously, this is pretty much just a match of the output of the BIP report. And this is where all of the data is stored. So at this point, we've gotten that data from the BIP report and inserted it into this business object using the integration that we just went through. And then the other business object set up here is called status, and I just manually populated these couple of records. And this will just populate the drop-down option, which you'll see in a second on the form itself, because in the drop-down, we want to show the label of either approve or reject. And then once you actually select a value, I want to pass through just A or R, because only the value A or R is going to be updated in the DFF itself. So that's just something that kind of makes it a little bit more user-friendly, essentially. So this is what the form itself looks like. So there's just a table on here, which is populated with all of the data from the invoice approval business object. It does have to be stored in an ADP in order for the table to access and manipulate it, since we're going to be editing some of the information here. So from a user perspective, when they open this page, they will go to number 1, which is to actually set the status. And the background of that status column is different, just to help identify that it is an editable field. So in order to edit the records, you would double click, and then that'll show the drop-down option. And then once you actually drop down to see the different values, that'll show the approve and reject from the status business object that I just showed. And then the second step is actually to select which one you want. So in this case, we'll just select approve. And then the third step over to the left is to save that change. So there are a few things going on behind the scenes at the same time on this form. So we're going to go through all of the action chains next of what is happening behind the scenes on this form. So the first action chain is to populate the ADP that the table is using. And this is initiated when the page is opened. Since it's gathering data and populating the page, it's best to have that happen automatically as soon as you open the page. So the first thing that's happening in this action chain is the call to the OIC integration that runs the BIP report and inserts the AP invoice data into the business object. So that happens first, and then once that's complete, we will use a REST connection to get the data from that business object and then assign it to the invoice ADP so that the table can display it. And then the next action chain is the table before row edit action. So whenever you have an editable field in a table, you need a before row edit action chain and a before row edit end action chain. And these are both fairly simple. So the before row edit chain, this starts when the table in the row is selected to be edited, and this essentially just stores the data within that specific row to a variable. So the only component in this action chain is to assign the variable updated row. And again, that just stores the row data that we're editing at this point. So the next one I mentioned already is the table before row edit end. And again, this only has one action in it, and this is the fire data provider event. And this will take that update row variable and map it over to the data within the business object. I'm sorry, it'll map it to the data within the ADP. So it updates the ADP with the new status value, essentially, that's being selected. And then the final action chain is save button. So this one's much more complicated, but still not terribly complicated. There's just a lot more components in here. So the first thing we want to do is set up a loop to go through all of the records in the invoice ADP. So all of the records that are displayed in the table of the page. Then we'll check if the status, which is the field that could be edited, is not null. So essentially, if the status is A or R, then we'll assign the variable update row, which just stores the updated rows data. And then we'll use another REST API call to connect to the business object again and update that specific record with the new status. So the only thing you need to map for that REST call is the ID of the row. And then the next one is calling the OIC connection to update the distribution DFF, which again, I'll go into in more detail in a little bit. So we'll call that integration and actually update the DFF on the distribution in ERP. So I'll go ahead and show the mapping for that REST call. There's a lot more fields to map here, but it's still pretty straightforward. In that connection for the the integration to update the DFF, there's a handful of parameters that it will be needed in order to successfully do the update. So that's all we're mapping here. And this is just from left to right on the current data record that we're looping through in the action chain. So it includes things like the invoice ID, the new status, the distribution number, etc. So that is all for the Visual Builder form and the action chains behind it. And then the final step is to go through the OIC integration that actually updates the DFF in ERP. So again, this gets called by the action chain in the Save button, and that's what initiates this integration. So we need one more new connection in order to complete this integration. It's another SOAP connection. The WSDL again is just the ERP base URL plus the ERP object DFF update service, which we'll be using to update the DFF. So that is all for this connection. And this is the entire integration that we need for updating the DFF. So this one's a little bit shorter than the last one. And we'll go through each component here as well. So the trigger is a little bit different in this case, because like I mentioned, there's a lot of parameters on this one so that we can pass in all the data we need in order to successfully run the web service. So the first thing we need to do is set up the relative resource URI. This one, again, you can define to whatever you like. And we're going to do a put action again, although this time we do want this to be a synchronous integration and send a response back. So the configure this endpoint to receive the response option has been checked. And then, like I just said a minute ago, there's a lot of parameters for this as well. So we need to configure those here. So this is the page to configure the parameters. There's 5 different parameters here that we need, which match all of what was just mapped in the Visual Builder action chain. And then these will be used eventually to map to the SOAP web service call to update the DFF. So the next step is to assign a variable here. So the reason why we do this is this variable essentially needs to take the status value from the parameter that's being passed in. So the new status that was saved on the Visual Builder page is passed into this integration, and then we're going to need to send it in through the SOAP web service a little bit later on. But this needs to be in JSON format, so it's a little bit easier to set that up in a variable rather than trying to do it directly in the mapping for the web service call. So I can zoom in on that so it's a little easier to see. In this case, like I said, it's going to be in JSON format, which is just a bracket. And like I mentioned way back in the beginning with the BIP report, this DFF specifically to hold the status is in attribute 14. And then we'll put the parameter of the status value that is being passed into this integration. So then that gets that whole DFF and its value put into JSON format so that we can use it a little bit later. So next step here is to configure the web service call to update the DFF. So again, since this is a SOAP web service, a lot of this stuff is already defined. And in this case, all we need to do is select the operation, which is update DFF entity details. And the rest of this is auto-populated. And then we'll go into the mapping for that web service call. So the mapping here, there's a few fields that need to be defined through text, and then there's some fields that will actually be mapped from a source to the target, left to right. So go into the nodes that we need to define with text values first. The first one is the operation mode, which is just single. The second one is the entity name, which in this case is payables invoice distribution. And then the last one is the context value, which is distribution. And the context value is something that is configured in ERP, so that could vary depending on how that's set up. And again, since these are text values, we want to make sure we include double quotes around all of them. And then the remainder of this mapping is all just dragging source to target. So in this case, pretty much nearly all of the fields are coming straight from the parameters that are being passed into the REST trigger in the very beginning. So distribution line, invoice ID, etc. And those are all mapped across to their corresponding user key in the web service call. And then the final thing is the variable that was just created for the DFF attribute in JSON format. This is where it's a little bit easier to have a variable because now you can just click and drag that across to the DFF attributes in the web service call. And then the last component here is the final mapping, just to send the response. Since this is a synchronous integration, we want to tell it what the response will be. And I configured this response to just include one field called update status. And so I mapped this to the update DFF response from the SOAP web service, just the result of that response over to the update status field. And so the reason why it's useful to have a response in this integration is because this always runs relatively quickly. And as soon as this response is sent back to Visual Builder, it fires off a notification to the page saying that the DFFs were updated. So it's just a little bit helpful for the user to have that confirmation that everything was saved and the DFF was updated. And then that is the final step for this integration. All right, so to wrap it up, we'll just go back to our agenda slide that we saw in the beginning. So we went through the business scenario example and what it was, and then each step to complete the solution, starting with the BIP report, then the OIC integration to run that report, then the Visual Builder form, and finally the OIC integration to update the status DFF on the distribution in ERP. So there's plenty of ways that you can expand upon and customize this solution. Being able to run a BIP report and properly write and read the response from it is super useful for tons of different applications. For things like if you want your VBCS form to have a search option with a drop-down list, that's a great scenario to pull data from ERP. And for example, you could say, these are all the AP invoice numbers, select one and then search so that the table doesn't automatically show all of the invoices all the time. Things like that can be expanded upon, and what we covered here can be applied to many different solutions. And so that is the end of the session. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Taylor. There's no questions in the chat right now, but if anybody does have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll give you a couple of minutes there. But otherwise, we appreciate you joining us today, and a recording of this webinar will be made available shortly online, and a link will be sent out to all attendees. So thank you for joining us. again, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. Look, it looks like you've been so thorough, Taylor, that there are no questions at this time. So we'll end the webinar. And again, a recording will be sent to all attendees. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.